45 minutes. I'm going to give you all 15 minutes or so for questions at the end. Kind of whatever you want up here. Well, what I'm here to talk about today is international political economy in China. So we've kind of done some talking about international relations in China. We had this awesome talk from Brooks and Woolworth. You've had some discussion of the history of China as a state and its development. Some conversation about its contemporary governance structures, and then some theories of international relations. International political economy is a little bit more, actually not a little, a lot more focused on the economic dimensions of governance, particularly in conditions of globalization. And I'm going to discuss some specific issues with respect to China, but first I'm going to kind of talk about what international political economy is more generally. International political economy, or IPE, which you can just put in your notes from this point forward, what people call it online, is kind of an alternative, more interdisciplinary approach to thinking about nation states and their methods of governance within conditions of globalization. It is relatively new. So most of the people that talk about it say that it kind of developed in the late 1970s and early 1980s. There were some kind of inklings towards or pushes towards some of the conclusions that IPE people have drawn earlier in the 50s and 60s, but they were mostly confined to people in international relations or sociology departments, so that it's kind of different. Okay, so international political economy takes some issue with what international relations says is the basic unit of politics, which is the nation state. So you've heard about some of these other theories of international relations. International relations is concerned literally about the relationship between nations, international relations between nations, okay? International political economy says that there's a lot more going on than just what's happening with nation states. Very briefly, I'm going to overview kind of 6 things that IPE talks about, although I'm not going to talk very much about any of them, and then we're going to talk a bunch about China. So 6 areas of concern for international political economy are international trade, globalization, international finance, North-South relations, multinational corporations, and hegemony. 6 things, okay? Okay, so very, very briefly again, history of international political economy. Emerged in the late 1970s, early 1980s. There was a situation where basically the oil-producing export countries, OPEC, used caps on oil essentially as a weapon to counter U.S. influence. And they limited the amount of oil they were producing as a way of sort of exercising political control over major Western countries, particularly in Western Europe and also the United States, Canada, and parts of North America. It kind of freaked a bunch of people out. A lot of U.S. foreign policy has been developed in response to this particular problem. And international political economy said, well, this is a pretty interesting case here, because this is a case of where states are using economic instruments or tools, exports, like oil, as a weapon, essentially. And so they argue that this illustrated the extent to which international relations and international economics, or international politics and international economics, were intertwined with one another. Economic policies, the choices made by oil-producing states to not export oil and to cap their production, were used politically. Does that make sense? And that kind of presents a problem, because for international relations, they usually kind of think of nation states as being motivated by their own kind of the variety of different frameworks we talked about, realism or liberal internationalism, being motivated by issues of threat, national security, and international economics just doesn't really think about politics at all as far as states are concerned. It just presupposes they act in their own self-interest according to this much bigger economic model that it has. Okay? So this whole situation with OPEC really kind of threw a monkey wrench in both of these theories, because it's like, well, On the one hand, these states aren't just acting in a fashion, that's concerned with national security and securing their population, or with, maximizing their self-interest in the political realm. They're using economic instruments in order to do that. That's not something that international politics had much to say about. And international economics was kind of like, these states are acting in a way that we didn't predict because political considerations entered into the realm of economic policy. Does that make sense? They're no longer making policy in the supposedly kind of neutrally self-interested fashion that international economics assumed that they would. So, interesting. Let's kind of develop a theory based on that. So, okay, we're going to talk about some of the specific areas. That's kind of where the history of IPE came from. Some of the things that this illustrates, really briefly, before I get into international trade, are kind of three things. One, multinational corporations have a really big influence on international politics. And people didn't really appreciate that prior to OPEC. I mean, some people did, obviously, but they didn't have a very good way of discussing it. The conversation was pretty noobish. So, role of multinational companies. Two, economic globalization itself, so the globe, also produces effects for the relations between nations. So, international politics, or politics at the global level, is not simply international, but involves global effects that go beyond the international. We'll talk about what some of those are in a second. And the third is that economic tools can be used in foreign policy, and often are. Okay. Hopefully everything's with me so far. Any questions at this point? We're going to move kind of quick because there's a lot of stuff. Okay, international trade. So, some of the things that people within international political economy look at with respect to trade. The different security issues related to exports and imports. So for example, I'll try to relate this stuff back to the topic as much as I can. So for example, there are a bunch of export restrictions that both the US and China have towards each other, targeted export restrictions. So banning the transfer of technologies that could be potentially dual use, technologies that could be used for military purposes. Does that make sense? So that raises some serious exports themselves are not just an issue of policy, of economic policy, an issue of trade and exchange. They're also issues of security, whether or not a country can access this particular technology. So for example, we're much more willing to trust Japan or Canada with some sorts of semiconductor technologies than we are China, because we're concerned about microchips, for example. There are other things too, there's a bunch of regulations for those of you who are doing space-related research on the sort of space technology that can be exchanged back and forth, because some of the rocket technology and targeting software can also be used as missile targeting software and technology. Okay, so international political economy looks at exports and imports not simply as economic flows, but as transfers of goods that potentially have security implications as well. Trade embargoes is another case. So blockading a country, maybe some of you debated on the Latin American topic, the Cuba embargo, the use of trade policy as an instrument for furthering strategic objectives, either by denying trade or by increasing the amount of trade. And a classic case of this was the US post-World War II using preferential access to US markets as a bargaining chip with other countries to extract certain concessions, to get them to agree to certain rules of international governance, to get them to ally with the United States against the Soviet Union. So there's a variety of different ways in which trade rules, for example, can be used as a mechanism for the exercise of power in international politics. Does that make sense? Hopefully, yes? Okay. If not, we'll have time for questions. So one of the things that's important to think about with trade from the perspective of international political economy, from the perspective of IPE, is that a lot of the times a market for goods may be much larger than the borders of a nation state, okay? A market for agricultural goods are an easy example. The US imports a ton of avocados from Mexico. So the market for avocados is much larger than either the US or Mexico. And in fact, it's global, since other countries, like Spain, for example, grows avocados as well, are able to penetrate different markets and access them. So to just discuss trade purely in terms of circulation of goods, purely in terms of nation states, is a little silly, since the scope of trade and the ripple effects of prices in one place on avocado prices in Spain affect avocado prices in Mexico, those ripple effects in markets and prices are much larger than nation states. So discussing them within the container of the nation state is a little bit problematic. Does that make sense? You can't just talk about it that way because that's just simply not how information and goods and services flow anymore. Okay, so exports and imports have security implications. Trade can be used strategically to extract concessions or to force a country to change its behavior, for example, through embargoes. And even the scope of markets themselves and the circulation of goods exceeds national borders. So these are several ways in which trade is a site at which both the nation state and global economic flows intersect. Does that make sense? And each is kind of insufficient to explain the other. Global economic flows can't explain states' use of trade as a strategic weapon, or their concerns about exports and imports, because it's just concerned about the circulation of goods and not the states that are controlling that circulation. But at the same time, describing it purely in terms of nation states is not very effective because the markets in which these things circulate, like avocados, for example, are too big. Okay, second element of IP is international finance. This includes, I'm quoting from somebody I got some of this information from, an analysis of exchange rate policies, foreign exchange systems, international capital movements. You don't have to write all this down, don't worry. Particularly portfolio capital and debt flows in the international and domestic institutions and political structures to which they relate. It's kind of complicated. Long story short, it's kind of complicated. International finance is probably not going to be, at least as far as I can tell, a huge part of the topic. There'll be some stuff related to investment that I'll discuss in a second. But finance is really complicated, and I don't want to get too deep into finance. It's not usually a big part of debate topics. I'll talk about it very briefly for a second. One of the easiest cases in which you can kind of see the overlap between nation states and financial issues, is in areas relating to currency. I don't want to get too deep into the yuan either, because then we have to start talking about fiat currencies versus currencies that are controlled purely by the government, that are non-market based. And then we start getting into some really complicated stuff. That's not necessary. A really easy example of currency issues and the relationship between nation states and political purposes and economic systems is just the euro. The purpose of the Eurozone was to produce, primarily was to produce political unification between countries in Europe as a way of kind of stemming the tide of nationalism and reducing the risk of another conflict, as well as beating back Soviet influence. So it is a political union. But there is also a union of there's one currency that's being used there as well. Although there are some states which are signatories to the EU, treaty or whatever, that are not Eurozone countries. But anyway, so what has happened is that a political union between countries has limited the scope of economic policies available, of economic policymaking tools available to policymakers in European countries, okay? They're not able to do certain things anymore, so they can't make some adjustments. They can't lower interest rates themselves. Don't worry about what that means. Just bear in mind that there are some policy tools that are not available to them anymore, economic policy tools. So some strategies of economic governance, as the euro demonstrates, are precluded by political arrangements. Does that make sense? And there are some cases we'll talk about in a minute where this is more specifically relevant to China. A lot of this also has to do with the way that debt is distributed globally and circulated, and who owes who what. And again, I don't want to focus too much on that either. Some of the stuff with trade partially involves issues related to the financing of trade and the way in which trade is going to be paid for in the future, basically, by one of the countries. And that gets really complicated because then you start talking about trade deficits, and then you start talking about the bonds and the currency system underwriting the trade deficits to make them politically feasible in the first place. And that is probably a little more than we need to get into right now. So suffice to say, financial markets are global a lot of the time. They're very large. And the intersection between finance and politics affects the sort of debt or the sort of interest rates that policymakers are able to exercise, the available tools that they're able to use. Does that make sense? So state policymakers often have their financial and political options circumscribed by institutions that they're party to. The only other thing I want to talk about is that with respect to finance that's really important is that financial markets are global for the most part. They're very large. This does not include just stock indices, which are a lot of times national, although what they're indexing and whether or not it's really national is very confusing as well. It also has to do with speculation on currency, with speculation about debt, with speculation about commodities and their relative costs, and the particular sources from which commodities emerge. So the thing that some of you will immediately be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. There's a whole discussion about whether or not there is such a thing as war premiums on oil, and whether or not the cost of oil changes in response to the political instability of an oil-producing region. So for example, if there's instability in Iraq, is it the case that oil companies increase the cost of oil, attach a little bit of extra cost to it, sell it at a higher price, put a premium on it, because getting out of Iraq, for example, is more risky now? Does that make sense? There's a whole debate about what effect geopolitics has on oil prices, and whether stability does or does not affect the price of oil. Does that make sense? That's a case of where, and that involves, if you think about that as commodities or trade, it also involves the financial markets in which oil is bought, future production of oil, or, we'll just say future production of oil is bought and sold. And which shares in oil companies are bought and sold. So that stuff gets really confusing, okay? And as a result, the globalization of finance means that states are not entirely in charge. Not only are they not entirely in charge because of political unions like the euro, they're also not entirely in charge because capital tends to move in a much more global fashion than is the nation state. So people, one of the things that's really confusing about this, and which is a kind of interesting case in the context of China, is that Apple, for example, has a significant amount of money in China, in Chinese banks and Chinese assets. So for example, they own factories or other kinds of capital companies in China. The problem is if they want to sell that stuff and bring it back into the US, they have to pay really heavy taxes on the capital that they're bringing back into the US. So on the one hand, when you're looking at the balance sheet of Apple as an investor in the company, their reserves are really difficult to calculate, and it gets really complex because the actual amount of money they have and the restrictions on how they're able to use it kind of depends on where the money's at. And how much money they have depends on whether they're planning on bringing it back or not, since the taxes will affect their total balance sheet. Does that make sense? So it gets really confusing. So international finance, it's globalized. There's a lot of different assets. People are exchanging globally information. They're speculating on all kinds of stuff. Nation states don't have total control over this stuff. They can do what they try to do what they can, but it's really tough for them to control this too much. Okay? Hegemony. Hegemony is based on a theory that powerful states supply public goods to the international system, including, for example, stable money, security, for example, freedom of the seas, and a system of free trade that can be shared by all and that works best when widely shared. So that's the positive theory of hegemony. People who are hegemony is stabilizing to make that argument. So there's a theory called hegemonic stability that argues that the international system is most prosperous when there is a hegemon, and that hegemonic decline, so for example, the decline of US leadership and influence, means that the international system falls into disorder and conflict with a resulting decline in peace and prosperity. To some extent, this concept of hegemonic stability intersects with what Brooks and Woolworth were describing as deep engagement. Since it's a theory that a hegemon, like the United States, is capable of producing an international system with relatively stable rules and expectations for governance that can exceed, in theory, the influence of even the hegemon. So they have a very particular theory of hegemonic stability that suggests that even if U.S. relative power declines, or the U.S. hegemony entirely disappears, if there's deep enough engagement, then the norms and expectations and behavior of the international system will already act as though the U.S. is still a hegemon. Does that make sense? There will still be an international system. In IPE, there's also a criticism of hegemony as well. So many of the people in IPE are neo-Marxists, are Gramscians, is a particular school of Marxism. So they are critical of hegemony because they think that there's a distinction between core states primarily in Western Europe and in the Northern Hemisphere, and peripheral states, which are in Latin America and Africa primarily, and then indigenous islands, indigenous island nations. The core states have the people that get paid a lot of money, basically, high-wage jobs, people who engage in design, services-based jobs like financial services, advertising, etc. People in the peripheral states mostly engage in manufacturing and kind of more dangerous jobs like commodity extraction or commodity production. So they mine for minerals, they produce, gold, a variety of other things. And so these theorists say that one of the functions of hegemony is to maintain a global asymmetry of power between the hegemon in the core, core northern states, and the states in the periphery, to keep them kind of in their particular positions. So that's the Marxist theory, which is a lot more kind of focused on the negative ethical effects and structural effects of hegemony. There's a theory of hegemonic decline that comes along with that, which is that hegemony is a temporary and self-limiting condition. Free rider states, particularly states in the core, prosper, expand, and increase the burden on the hegemon. Those states start demanding more and more. So free rider states in this equation are states like the Netherlands or Canada to some extent, Australia, states that spend a lot less money on the military. They're not as concerned about building up the force necessary to maintain hegemony. They bear some of the cost, but not as much of it. They start to expect more and more out of the U.S. and to expect it to take on more and more of their international security budget. They start cutting their military defense budgets. The overcommitment that results from them taking this, from these free rider states taking this action, means that the hegemon can't bear the costs any longer. And there's two things, one of two things happens. Either the hegemon begins to put domestic interests over its international obligations, or it becomes too weak to honor its widespread commitments. And this is what some people have argued has happened in two separate realms in the United States. One is that increasingly there is backlash to globalization and to global U.S. influence. There's a lot of people who prefer the U.S. to be isolationist, who are angry about U.S. overcommitment or over-involvement in other countries, who don't like free trade, and who are just simply like, we've had enough. Other people can deal with these problems for us. Some of whom, that sort of discourse sometimes pops up with like some of the Tea Party people. There are some left libertarians who say some of that kind of stuff. Bless you. The other side of that is people who say that, for example, the Iraq War and the other battlefront in Afghanistan meant that the U.S. was so overcommitted in the Middle East that it couldn't possibly project power in East Asia, so it was going to run out of ability to honor its security commitments to Taiwan and Japan and some other places there. Does that make sense? So one of those theories is domestic, the other one is international. And you're starting to see that international political economy does not really draw a sharp distinction between the international and the domestic in the same way that some other theories do. It sort of tries to theorize both at the same time. And there's plenty of questions about its ability to do that, but it at least acknowledges that the two are kind of intertwined. Hegemony has been very important for IP. A lot of people say that all of these global trade rules, finance, etc., are the byproducts of a hegemonic system, and there's a big debate about whether that's good or bad. Like I said, there's a lot of Marxist people, and then there's a lot of people who are like realist or institutional stability theorists, like we kind of heard from Brooks and Woolworth a little bit. They're a little bit less like IPE from what I heard about the stuff they were talking about, but their stuff is involved a lot of different pies. It's very comprehensive. Okay, so I said this thing about people criticizing hegemony. I'm going to briefly talk about the next section because I already sort of talked about it. North-South relations is the next one. So previously, international relations in the Cold War was really focused on East-West relations. The relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union and the various blocs that they were mobilizing to counter one another. IPE is more concerned about North-South relations, the relations between the mostly industrialized countries in the Northern Hemisphere and the mostly less developed countries, or LDCs, in the Southern Hemisphere, that have less money and are generally in kind of poorer condition to the extent that they just don't have as much influence or power. And that's kind of where this core periphery theory comes from, is this distinction between North and South, the idea that these other countries who have all been affected by colonialism are kind of placed in a dependent position of dependence. There's literally a theory called the theory of dependence within a broader world system. And that world system itself emerged from colonialism, which was the driving force for globalization, which connected a variety of different markets across the globe that otherwise would not have been related at all. Does that make sense? So even globalization itself, these people are arguing, is a historically specific temporal, like we're in that particular epoch right now, but it has not always been that way. Globalization is to some extent an artifact of colonialism. And one of the enduring traces of colonialism is this divide between North and South. And they have a critique of economic development that's also based on this theory. This is actually very important with respect to China, so we'll get back to this in a second, but a lot of this theory, because China is a communist state, in theory at least, although, some of this that Turner and Dr. McFarland talked about kind of complicates that a little bit. It's still the case that it is, in theory, a communist state. Some of these theories, these Marxist theories of international power, are actually pretty important for understanding what China is doing. Okay, multinational corporations. Used to be, around the Cold War, that the theory basically said there was what people called an invisible handshake between home countries and the companies that were based there. So like Ford and, not Nike, but Ford, for example, had like a handshake agreement with the US government. The US government would try and produce a political situation that was conducive to those countries getting into other countries' economies and allowing them to compete there and to export stuff to those countries. And in exchange, those companies would be understood to be working with the home country. So there's a relationship between the two. If the U.S. government needs something, the Ford Corporation is going to help out whenever they can. Because they have a big factory in wherever. They have a factory in Hungary, and we need some stuff in the Cold War. Probably not in Hungary, but you know what I mean. Germany. These people say that since the Cold War has ended, that relationship between corporations and statecraft has kind of changed pretty fundamentally. Instead, they talk about global commodity chains, or GCCs. So one thing a lot of people don't know is that actually Ford doesn't really produce very much at all. Ford is actually really a branding and design company, and this, by their own admission, they say this, a branding and design company based in the US that sells the products of many independent car manufacturers who build their products for them. They're like, here's what this car we want to look like. Here's what we want this car to look like. We're contracting you as the manufacturer to build this. And those manufacturers subsequently will contract other people or to get parts, to get the raw materials for the parts, to build the factories in which the cars are assembled, or to build the machines that now autonomously build the cars without very many human operators. So like this whole system becomes really complicated. There's, one Ford car might be built in a factory that's owned by one company that has machines building the car that are owned by another company or leased from another company. That company may be buying the materials for the machine from 2 or 3 other companies in other countries, and the car parts themselves may be from 3 or 4 other countries, and their particular commodity extraction processes, which may be nationalized or run by other companies. So it's like a really complicated web, okay? Big network. So what people have said is that instead of thinking about these companies and their relationship to home countries, we've got to start thinking about it as just investment of capital and jobs and people's ability to work the particular position and the type of wages they're able to get. It's way more complicated than countries and companies, since what's even part of a company has become a very complex and ambiguous question. Does that make sense? Okay. These GCCs play a really important role in state governance, in the way nation-states govern themselves. So there's a very influential theory called the competition state, which basically says that increasingly, some of the people might be a little generic, I've already talked about this a little bit, basically says that countries compete with one another to attract capital and investment, and to attract businesses, and to attract a very small privileged class of workers that are called the talented. I don't want to get into that, it's very problematic. That's what my thesis is about. I'm not feeling it. But in any event, yeah, there's this Also some workers, but not really. That's not a very important part. So, various countries have to compete with one another to offer, say, for example, preferential tax agreements. We won't tax you, Ford, if you want to put a factory in our country, because you'll bring us a bunch of manufacturing jobs. And so it's literally a race to the bottom, a race to have the fewest kind of environmental standards, to pay the least, to offer the most preferential tax arrangements. It's not as simple as that in every single case, because there are reasons why certain companies would prefer to be in places that are more highly educated or have better environmental standards or are more developed. There are reasons why companies, it would be too expensive for them to move. There's a big debate about the extent to which they perceive or are concerned about national tax policies or even municipal tax policies. So it's very complicated, but the thing to know is that countries are largely competing with one another, the theory goes, to attract businesses. So countries competing to attract businesses. Finance is also global. Trade is global, and this global system is conducted, in part at least, on the basis of a hegemon, and then the other countries arrayed around that hegemon that are either in a relatively privileged position with respect to it, or a relatively underprivileged position with respect to it. The byproduct of all of this is the last section that I'm going to talk about before we get to China specifically, which is globalization. So all of this stuff adds up to globalization. Globalization is kind of a big jumble of all kinds of crap all thrown together. Just somebody took like a big box of like Lego pieces and tossed them out. Like some of the colors are companies and some are countries, and they're all over the place. There's a lot of debate about globalization. One of the major, what is it? One of the major theories, or three major positions that all revolve around the same question are: what is the role of the nation state in globalization? Is globalization mostly just like totally dictated by sovereign states exercising their military power and interests? Is globalization mostly dictated by global capital, which has largely eroded the sovereignty of those states? Or is there kind of a third place in between where states are both affected by and affect the trajectory of globalization? Does that make sense? The third position, which I think is probably right and is the one that most people defend, is called the transformationist position. The competition state is a particular variant of the transformationist position. Nation states affect the composition of globalization through trade agreements, through political alliances, through export or import, trade embargoes, through interest rate hikes or decreases, all sorts of different mechanisms, deciding to declare a war. But they are also affected, for example, as the case of the competition state, issues of global flows of trade, global commodity chains illustrate by globalization. They can't dictate all that stuff. Sometimes companies just get to decide where they want to go. So the role of the state is not the only question. The question is also the role of all these other institutions and systems and actors. Global financial systems, systems of trade and exchange, transportation infrastructure, energy and energy stability, environmental systems that have all sorts of feedback effects on production networks and on just conditions of living, the likelihood of a political revolution or not. So this is a very grand kind of perspective. There's not like one unified theory that it takes. These are just the set of problems that IPE is concerned with. And one of the other things it's concerned with is that while it may be the case that nation states still have a lot of influence and power, the boundaries and borders between nation states, everybody pretty much agrees, are starting to erode. And the question is, what response nation states have to that? Do they invite that erosion through, more trade agreements, allowing lots of immigrants in, allowing financial exchange and information exchange easily? Or do they fight it by localizing their data infrastructure and by keeping out immigrants and by being protectionist and by blah, blah, blah? Does that make sense? So part of it is less a theory that says this is what states are doing, and more a set of conditions, and then we study how states react. Does that make sense? It doesn't determine the behavior of states. It tells us a couple things to look for and areas of interest. Okay, questions about this stuff so far? Okay, so I'm going to talk about China for a minute. I'm not going to get through all the stuff related to China because it's like there's a billion things. Go on. What do I know? I'm just some guy. So China and IP particularly, big subject you'll be surprised to know, just kidding, there you won't, this literature is the nature of China's rise. What does this mean? What's going on? What is China rise anyway? What's all the hype about? Well, the big question, pretty much everybody agrees, well, China's getting more money, and they're doing more stuff than they used to, and they seem to be gathering more influence. Brooks and Wolford, I think, said it's pretty indisputable that they're relatively gaining power, although to what extent and what that means is completely up for debate. IPE has some answers to this question. One theory is called the state developmentalist theory. This theory says essentially that China is gradually rising and is attempting to internally modernize its infrastructure and technology. In the process, it is producing a sort of alternative model to neoliberal globalization, which I'll kind of get into explaining that a little bit in a second. I don't want to talk too much about that, but it's important. So what China has to do is simultaneously manage internal disruption that's created by modernization. So for example, as factories are developed and people, there's more urban infrastructure, the economy becomes increasingly technologized. People move out of out of towns where there's guild-based labor or relatively inefficient like human farming, and they start industrializing some of the farming and agricultural systems. So there's all this disruption that's produced by modernization. So you got to manage that. They've also got to manage the external imposition of neoliberal global governance upon them, which is, for example, I'll talk about in a second, things like the TPP, the WTO, the particular sets of rules that people are trying to force China to accede to agree to follow. Okay, that's one theory. That's the state developmentalist theory. That theory says that China is essentially relatively peaceful in its rise. The reason that there seems to be disruption is because China is trying to manage simultaneous internal and external issues with this particular path of governance. There's also a radical globalization approach. One of the major people here are like Stephen Gill or David Harvey. So they say neoliberal globalization is sort of a new constitutionalism, a system in which state governance is constrained within market-based rules. So for example, the WTO has rules about the amount of subsidies you're allowed to spend on your own institution. So what a subsidy is basically where a country, let's say you have like a national airline, Turkish Airlines, for example. Turkey's gotten in trouble at some points for subsidizing its airline. What they could do is they could say, okay, well, we have a national airline. We're just going to make the cost of all the flights super cheap by just paying the difference between the actual cost of the flight and the price on the ticket. We can give you a flight for $10. There's a bunch of airlines in Europe where the national airline is subsidized. It's like, I was just there a couple months ago. You could get a flight from, no joke, from Ireland to Serbia for $3. Yeah, it's they're super subsidized. It's really cheap. So there's a bunch of debate about, it's pretty awesome actually, to be honest. There's a bunch of debate about whether, the WTO essentially places restrictions on your ability to subsidize your own companies or your national industries. You're not allowed to just make it so that your corn is really, really cheap so that you can sell it to other countries and just blow them out of the water because they can't keep up the amount that you're subsidizing. Because it's not really the market-based price. So the presumption within those systems of global rules is that the market is a particularly effective mechanism for coordinating states. It's neoliberal because it's based on a particular set of assumptions about how currency should work, how prices should be signaled, about how competition should work, about the importance of private property and what constitutes private property. So it's a legal regime. WTO is one example. There's a variety of global banks that are involved in this. There's a bunch of different institutions and organizations. So the question is the extent to which, is China being forced into this system of neoliberal globalization? The people who are from the radical globalization perspective say yes. They have a relatively deterministic perspective. Basically, China, sorry, you don't really have a lot of options. You're getting forced into this. Neoliberalism is hegemonic. It tries to force you into this particular system of governance. So David Harvey says, for example, that there's such a thing as neoliberalism with Chinese characteristics, which means that China has an authoritarian model. It's not really concerned about political freedoms like freedom of press or speech or religion, but that it is concerned increasingly about market-based freedoms. And that is illustrated by the 2001 accession of China to the WTO, and roughly around 1992, China's willingness to make itself open to trade and foreign direct investment, which I'm about to talk about in a second. So essentially, these radical globalization people are saying that China's rise in growth is a byproduct of it being interpenetrated by foreign elite capitalists, basically. That elites are increasingly investing, in other countries, are investing significant sums of money in modernizing China, and in turn, they're able to do that because China has done things like allow it to have had relatively lax labor protections, for example, so that it's really cheap to build stuff in China because they have low wages. They say that's low-wage competitiveness. That's just a strategy that competition states use within neoliberal globalization to ensure that companies come there, and it's really dangerous. Or that China, despite the vagaries of its currency, which is very complicated, essentially, because it owns so many U.S. Treasury bonds, has backed its own currency with the U.S. currency, which means China is actually really dependent on the U.S. That its currency is backed by reliance on the stability of the U.S. currency. So that's part of, people are saying that's part of neoliberal globalization. It illustrates that China has become dependent upon the hegemon, the U.S., and its international system. And there's not much that it's going to be able to do to get out of this. The problem with this approach, some people say, so for example, this guy, Jerry Strange, says that, I don't think he's related to Ken Strange, but I don't know. This guy says that this approach is way too deterministic. That it says that there's basically nothing China can do. It's going to be like hegemonically kind of forced into this system, and that it makes this weird contradiction where on the one hand it says there's this global constitution that allows states to agree, sort of to become part of globalization through consent, through the appearance of rules that everybody's agreed to, while on the other hand saying that the U.S. is hegemonic and has a privileged position within the system. And they're kind of like, why do you need to have people's consent if the U.S. is just forcing them to do everything? That doesn't really make sense. It's kind of a serious contradiction. So there's another approach that is kind of similar back against the state developmentalist approach that says that China is exercising influence externally as a way of carving out its own autonomy to craft its internal policy. So China is exercising power in East Asia in order to grant itself autonomy to craft its own internal system of economic development that is not based on neoliberal constitutionalism. And it agrees to rules like the WTO Accords in order to exercise influence to make its own policy. Does that make sense? That's actually just a strategy of internal development that has been misread by people, okay? This is some just like very broad and general stuff. People talking about China's rise within the perspective of IPE. You can start to see how IPE involves the multiple layers of state policy planning, global financial networks, international institutions, multinational corporations, finance. Those things are all interlinked, okay? Okay, so some specific things. For example, one specific issue with China's foreign direct investment. We've talked a little bit about how, we've heard other people talk about how the CCP maintains a lot of its stability and its legitimacy on the basis of growth. A lot of that growth comes from other countries making investments in China's industrialization, making investments in Chinese infrastructure to ensure that it's a place where they can do business. And in the process, they make a bunch of money. So foreign direct investment is investment by one entity in one country into an entity in another country. Basically, a U.S. company invests a bunch of money in a Chinese company. Simplest way to put it. There are more complexities involved, whatever. So one of the things that the FDI is supposed to measure, the amount of foreign direct investment is supposed to measure, is the extent to which other countries have, and other companies in other countries have confidence in China's economy, in its government, whether or not they perceive its government to be a stable place to invest. Does that make sense? So in investing from one company in Europe, the Netherlands, to a company in China, part of what that company is doing is it is placing a bet on the desirability of China as a place for doing business. Does that make sense? Kind of complicated, but that's how foreign direct investment works. It's very important to the stability of China. China relies a lot on attracting foreign direct investment in order to fund a lot of the projects that it's undertaking. There's basically 4 different classes of foreign industries. So foreign industries can be, investment in foreign industries can be encouraged, restricted, prohibited, or permitted because there are no really explicit rules about what you can do with that industry. Does that make sense? So you can, in some industries, it's entirely illegal for foreigners to invest. And that comes back around to the stuff I talked about with export restrictions and import restrictions, whether or not people can screw with China's industry. It might be important to national security. Other things, there's severe restrictions. There are two classes of restrictions, and I bring these up because these will be affirmatives. People will try to get China to change these policies. Two things. Sino-Foreign Joint Venture, or JV. It's an industry-specific regulation that requires foreign ventures to have a Chinese partner, like another company, in order to carry out their business. In 2015, China, the Chinese National Development and Reform Commission, the CNRDRC, severely curbed the number of industries in which this provision is in effect. But there's still like 15 whole industries where this happens, some of which are very large industries. The other rule that's important is majority Chinese ownership, which is in about 44 industries as of 2015. Foreign owners, according to this rule, and these in affected industries are not allowed to own more than 50% of shares in select industries. So what do these two things mean? It means if people in the US want to invest in China, they have to either have a partner in China, like a partner company, or they have to let somebody in China own 50% of the company. Does that make sense? That can act as a serious barrier to investment. People are like, I don't know if I want to deal with that. But it's also important to note, like I said, that the extent to which these rules are in effect is decreasing. So China is becoming more open to foreign direct investment in the status quo. Does that make sense? So this is going to be a major part, I think, of the economy affirmatives, is investment treaties. Various sorts of bilateral investment treaties, and trying to induce China to change the rules that it uses to, restrict or control the flow of investment. Okay, another major thing. Trans-Pacific Partnership. Might be an act, include China in it, definitely will be a DA, and when it passes or fails, the ramifications of that in probably the lame duck session will have big effects on the second semester of the season, okay? TPP is a trade agreement that piggybacks on a pre-existing agreement that other countries have. The countries that would be affected and are parties to the TPP are Singapore, Brunei, Chile, New Zealand, the US, Australia, Peru, Vietnam, Malaysia, Mexico, Canada, and Japan. So a bunch. I think that's 17. Pretty sure it's right. And then there are several additional parties who might become parties to it later or are party to the negotiations. And those are South Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, Taiwan, and Indonesia. And this agreement has been, people have been working on this thing since at least 2005, which is when the original agreement between several of the countries was initiated. It's really been longer than that, but whatever. So people say there's a bunch of different effects. Just from the perspective of the agreement itself, a lot of economists, usually you see economists and they're like, protectionism is the worst, free trade is the best, free trade. With the TPP, economists are a lot more lukewarm on this. There's like a really big debate about whether this thing is actually a good or bad idea. And that's because there actually aren't very many barriers to trade between the US and the countries that are part of the TPP. Like Mexico and Canada, we already have a free trade agreement with them, so like we don't really have any barriers to trade. So the people say there's two purposes of what's going on with the TPP. One is geopolitical. It's a strategy for the US to exercise influence and to deepen its trade relationship with Japan, which is a country that we do not have a bilateral free trade agreement with, because of that agreement is really politically unpopular, both from the large segments of the US and Japan. So people think that by packaging this in this particular way, it will make it so we can create a backdoor bilateral free trade agreement with Japan. And that's a way of shoring up the alliance. Potentially including South Korea is the same deal. It increases interdependence between those countries. It means that the US and Japan get to be the ones that are making rules for the markets in East Asia. And now you can start to see where this theory of global constitutionalism and neoliberal globalization fits in. That people are saying that the TPP is an effort to impose a global constitution on East Asia that has a particular set of trade rules and forces countries to conduct themselves in particular ways. Does that make sense? So that's how this whole kind of hegemonic power balancing thing it actually shows up in the real world. The other purpose of this thing, apart from geopolitics, is intellectual property rights and copyright. So it is actually, some people argue the TPP is actually protectionist, that it actually restricts the flow of goods because it imposes industry-specific regulations globally. So, for example, regulations on movie industries, making sure that they respect copyright laws. And you can't just like, go to Russia, or not Russia, but like Thailand, and just like load some stuff on kick-ass torrents and like put it on there for everybody to look at. No, they're like, no, you can't do that. That's one of the functions of the TPP. The TPP also involves harmonization of intellectual property rights, which has a lot to do with software and pharmaceuticals. So the purpose is to basically cut off the flow of generic drugs that use, technology developments from U.S. pharmaceutical companies, but don't pay for their use of that technology, those particular innovations. So that's the other function of it. China had really opposed this agreement until 2012, and then they kind of walked back their opposition a little bit. They really hated it, and then they said, well, maybe we'd be willing to join in the future, we'll see. Some people think that China's taking a wait-and-see approach because they think that China thinks that this agreement's not going to happen. And there's a lot of doubt about whether or not it will actually happen. And some people think that China wants to join it in the future. There's also questions about the extent to which, and some of you that are working on the CDA probably understand this, there's a big power jockeying that's happening in China right now about whether or not it will have market-based economic reforms. And so some people think that China acceding to the TPP or the TPP happening will allow those people who are arguing for more economic reforms to win, and that they will be able to be the ones who exercise influence in the path that Chinese development takes. So that's kind of some of the stuff that's happening with the TPP. China is trying to determine how to react to it. It involves some of these issues with power balancing and international institutions, who gets to write the rules, and who has influence. Last thing, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. This is an infrastructure investment bank, a bank that gives loans to companies who want to make infrastructure investments to build particular bridges, cell phone towers, modernize their cities, lay down huge quantities of concrete, whatever, build highways. There's 20 different countries that have signed on to it, many of which are poorer countries. China is going to give these countries loans out of this like $50 billion pot that they've created. One of the reasons people were like, what the hell is this thing for? Is that there already exists an Asian Development Bank that's sort of supposed to perform some of these functions. The problem is that, from China's perspective, is that that bank is primarily controlled by Japan, who has much, much, much more influence in the bank than China does, even though China is a party to the bank. Furthermore, that bank is itself a subsidiary and partially controlled by the IMF and the World Bank, which are notorious for imposing certain free market rules on countries they give loans to. So some of you have probably heard the phrase structural adjustment before. Structural adjustment programs were programs that required countries that took out loans and could not repay them from the IMF and the World Bank, many of which were post-colonial states, to make massive market-based reforms to their economies, to structurally address their economies. The bank that China is creating does not have those conditions attached to its loan guarantees. So you don't have to do those things. In fact, you explicitly, they're promising you up front that you don't. So there's lots of different kinds of loans that China's making available. And a lot of people are saying that the function of this bank is to deepen China's stranglehold or power. People say the same thing about the U.S. The TPP is the U.S. trying to exercise its stranglehold over East Asia. That this is China's kind of answer to some of the TPP stuff. That they're trying to kind of push back in the other direction by making other countries that are relatively poorer kind of indebted to China, dependent upon China's investment. And it fosters both diplomatic goodwill and it literally makes them financially dependent upon China because they take out huge sums of money to do these infrastructure investments. So this is a way of exercising influence that doesn't require some of the free market principles imposed by the IMF and World Bank. And some people are saying, as a result, it's not just China offering an alternative, it's China trying to produce a different global constitution with a different set of rules for economic behavior and relations between countries. So the Asian Infrastructure Bank is also a big deal as well. It's there's a bunch of issues here. IPR, trade, investment in bilateral exchange, the TPP, the various rules about whether you are and are not allowed to subsidize particular industries, and the exercise of power involved in the relative position of states involved in all of these agreements, and who they benefit and don't benefit. And kind of working in the background, which I didn't even really talk that much about in the context of China, are all of these major companies that are interlinked between China and the US and back and forth, who have very complex interests, like Apple, which we talked about earlier. That is a significant sum of its assets, or percentage of its assets, in China, and will have a difficult time bringing them back because of taxation problems. Cool, so hopefully that helps to kind of explain and offer a little bit of a bigger perspective on some of the stuff that like trade, finance, some of these other issues have for just the exercise of power and the organization of global politics. This stuff is not just like trade, how boring, like it's just people moving goods from one place to another. It's also a strategic way in which states position themselves relative to one another and exercise influence and kind of determine the extent to which they're able to even act. Okay, questions about this stuff from anybody? Yeah.
I don't know if you talked about this, but what's a BIT?
A BIT is a bilateral investment treaty.
I know that.
So what a bilateral investment treaty usually does is it's kind of complicated. It involves like a bunch of different things, but a lot of the times it enshrines certain rules and expectations about the amount and the rules for investments between two countries in their different industries. And a lot of the time, so one of the things that will happen if you hear like about a trade war, countries get pissed at each other for doing things that are to the detriment of the other country. Maybe the US puts a tariff on Chinese solar panels because we think China's subsidizing them. China gets mad, they do some stuff to restrict the visas of scientists that we're trying to send for conferences or whatever. The principle of a bilateral investment treaty is to do the opposite. It's to try and dismantle a bunch of barriers that each country has towards the other one through a set of agreed upon rules. So China and the US, in the case of a BIT, which is the starter pack app from the DDIX, and probably an app that a bunch of other people will read. Somebody was reading this at Kansas when I was there earlier. But these sort of treaties intend to deepen and provide rules and expectations for exchange between the US and China, or any two countries really, in particular areas, including green technology or finance or whatever else, agriculture, could be a bunch of stuff. So the bilateral investment treaty is a way of reducing barriers by making concessions back and forth, as opposed to increasing barriers by retaliating back and forth. Does that make sense? Cool. Other questions? Things people are wondering. You have no questions about trade and finance. They're just that bored. Fair enough. It's not for everybody. Yes?
So to my understanding, is international economy, is that the result of international economy, international trade,
International political economy is kind of a combined study of international economics and international politics. That's what you're going to ask. It's sort of both, but as you combine the two, you don't just like mash them together. In the process of combining them, certain things like the role of companies start to become more important, that neither one of those things really talk about too much. Does that make sense? Yeah?
You said that the AIIB was a way for China to create a global constitution in the East Asia region. Do you know what some of the rules or guidelines are for joining the AIIB, or is it just...
I'm honestly not exactly sure. I know that the major thing that people were publicizing in the articles I read about it was that it doesn't have the same sort of conditions for the loans that it gives out. And that's the extent to which people are interpreting it as, you're going to hear this term a lot, revisionism. Like China's trying to revise the global order. And that's the extent to which people interpret the AAIB as being revisionist, is because it has a different set of expectations about loan payback than the existing architecture of global financial institutions does. Does that make sense? So I don't actually know that much about it, but I do know that that is the politically significant thing that people have talked about with respect to the AIIB. Other questions? Yeah.
Does the idea that states try to position themselves with different economic agreements, does that apply to bilateral cooperation?
Oh yeah, definitely. So some people will say actually that there are people who say that there's this theory that you probably, maybe you've heard this before, if you've ever gotten like an impact term debate about free trade. There's this theory called the spaghetti bowl, which is that the problem with bilateral trade agreements is that they're actually protectionist because they create special rules for exchange between two countries to the exclusion of all of the other countries. So actually what you do is you grant special market status to particular countries. Does that make sense? So in the process, people argue that it's market distorting because it gives preferential access, that it's rent seeking because it can be used by the state itself to manipulate the market to the advantage of particular elites or people. So yeah, bilateral trade agreements are a technique that states use politically to gain power over other states. And they're also a mechanism for, sometimes for excluding other states on purpose. So they can be a way of deepening ties, but they can also be a way of excluding other states by virtue of their not being a party to the bilateral free trade agreement. Does that make sense? That's one of the things people argue with respect to China, is that excluding them from the TPP is a protectionist move, essentially, to give these other, between 12 and 18 countries, preferential access to U.S. markets that is not enjoyed by China in quite the same way. Does that make sense? Cool, yeah, Zach.
I've heard that term special market status be used a couple of different times. I'm assuming there's no official special market status there.
No, there is. Yeah.
Oh, is there?
Yeah. It is an official term. Yeah.
So like the U.S. can just write up that this country has special market status?
Essentially. I mean, yeah, it's just it's a designated diplomatic status that basically, like, there's a category of trade rules that applies to states that have that designation. So if the U.S. decides to extend that designation to them, then that category of rules applies to them, as opposed to states that do not have it, for which other trade rules apply. Does that make sense? Yeah.
What are some examples of like invisible handshakes in China that they're using right now to advance their political power?
Well, that's kind of what I was saying. The invisible handshake theory doesn't really hold quite as much as it used to. There are still some companies that it's pretty important for, so I can kind of back and forth give you a couple of examples. So it's really important in industries where there's a lot of defense application. So there is still an invisible handshake probably between the U.S. and Boeing, for example, or Lockheed Martin, because they're like really important defense contractors. But there's not like, between Apple and the U.S., there's definitely not an invisible handshake. Like Apple is just like, no, we don't want to give you our phones, sorry, FBI, we don't care. Like, they just never care. So some companies, yeah, some industries, yeah, in some places, no. People have said that that's one of the functions of some of the Chinese semiconductor companies, that they're an invisible handshake, and that China is trying to, it will use or is using, that China owns a really large amount of rare earth minerals that are used to make the microchips for like cell phones or, you know, for computers. And they're also used in solar panels and a bunch of other like super high-tech stuff. Some people say that China could strategically use either its supply of rare earth minerals or the semiconductor industries it has that take those rare earth minerals and turn them into high-tech goods strategically against the U.S. Does that make sense? So that's a case of where there's like theoretically an invisible handshake. And that by deepening the U.S.'s import dependence on Chinese rare earth minerals and Chinese semiconductor companies, China is allowing itself to exercise political influence over the U.S. Does that make sense? Because they're so important to just like our everyday lives at this point. Make sense? Other questions?